What if your overthinking is not a failure of faith, but a sign that your heart is ready for a prophetic reset? In this cinematic breakdown, we unpack the clinical insights and profound spiritual tools of Dr. Rania Awaad on self-regulation and finding Sakinah, calm, in the storm of anxiety. Okay, let's dive into this. Because let's be honest, anxiety is just an intensely universal human struggle, isn't it? Especially looking back at the world since 2020, I mean, we've all felt that grip of uncertainty. Now, we often hear this narrative that having these worries somehow means we just aren't relying on our faith enough. But I want to reassure you, right here, right from the start, acknowledging your mental health is absolutely not a weakness. Actually, it's the very first step in a deeply supportive historical journey toward real healing. Section 1. The Storm of Anxiety. Let's start with a quick clinical reality check. So our modern world has fundamentally shifted our baseline of stress. And before we even look at the spiritual solutions, we really have to recognize the biological and social reality of what we're dealing with. This data right here, it comes from the World Health Organization regarding the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. A staggering 41% of adults reported experiencing anxiety or depression, nearly half the population. Think about that. If you look around a crowded room, essentially every other person is dealing with this in some form. So if you've been feeling overwhelmed, I really want you to feel seen and validated right now. You are absolutely 100% not alone in this. And when we look at the younger generation, wow, the numbers are even more striking. Youth anxiety rates, specifically for ages 18 to 29, spiked 6 times higher than they were just a single year prior in 2019. 6 times. It just goes to show the severe impact that uncertainty and, frankly, disrupted life milestones had on our youth during such incredibly formative years. So, how do we actually define what it is we're feeling? Well, fundamentally, anxiety is an intense feeling of discomfort that drives fear and avoidance. It's just human nature to want to avoid what makes us uncomfortable, right? But here's the catch. Avoidance gives you this temporary sense of relief, but all that does is teach your brain that avoiding it was the right move. So the next time that trigger pops up, your anxiety actually spikes even higher. It creates this vicious, escalating cycle that doesn't just magically go away on its own. So the crucial point is understanding the difference between normal, everyday stress and clinical anxiety, because we all have a baseline of worry, right? Maybe you spend about an hour of your day scattered in small little chunks, stressing about running late to work, or what you're going to wear, or if you forgot your water bottle at the gym. That is completely normal. But clinical anxiety, that is when rumination just completely paralyzes your day, sometimes consuming 5 or more hours. It's an intense, debilitating worry that actively interferes with your ability to just live your life. To prove that this explainer is grounded in solid medical science, let's briefly unpack the 6 main categories of clinical anxiety that Dr. Awaad outlines. First, we have generalized anxiety, where worries just sort of spill into every single bucket of your life: health, wealth, family. Then there's panic disorder, which brings on sudden, really intense feelings of dread. Social anxiety, which, to be clear, isn't just being shy, but a real paralyzing dread of public interaction. Then there are phobias, which are irrational but intensely real fears of specific things like heights or flying. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, which is triggered by past trauma. And finally, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. And the good news? Each one of these has highly effective, specific treatments available today. Section 2. A prophetic response. We're going to shift from the clinical to the spiritual. Now that we have a handle on the clinical diagnosis, let's shift our narrative to the spiritual response. We're going to take a really beautiful, supportive, historical journey here. There's this incredibly powerful story from the Islamic tradition about a companion named Abu Umama. The Prophet Muhammad walked into the mosque outside of the regular prayer times and found Abu Umama sitting there, absolutely crippled and overwhelmed by worry and mountain debt. Now pay close attention to what happened next. The Prophet didn't shame him, he didn't lecture him and tell him he had weak faith for worrying so much. Instead, he completely validated Abu Umama's very real human emotion. He made space for it, and then he offered him a specific supplication, a practical tool to help him self-regulate and eventually change his situation. And this brilliantly illustrates our next point, which is a quote: "Seek out treatments, O servants of God, because Allah does not send down a disease unless he sends with it a treatment." This isn't just a suggestion. This is a direct command from the Prophet. It means that relying on your faith absolutely does not mean ignoring modern medicine. Seeking out psychiatric or psychological help, going to therapy or taking medication, is not a lack of faith. It's actually a prophetic command to go out and find the cure that was sent down specifically for you. Section 3. The first psychiatric words. let's guide you right out of the modern stigma surrounding mental health and step into the breathtaking, highly advanced history of 9th century Islamic psychology. You know, Western textbooks often claim that OCD was first formalized in the 19th century, but Dr. Awaad shares this absolutely fascinating anecdote. She translated a 9th century text by a scholar named al-Balkhi and brought it to a top OCD expert at Stanford. When he read it, he literally started jumping up and down in excitement. Seriously. Why? Because a full 1,000 years before Western psychology mapped it out, al-Balkhi had perfectly classified OCD and even described what we now call exposure therapy. And later, in the 11th century, brilliant minds like Ibn Sina were already successfully treating psychosomatic illnesses. They completely understood how deeply the mind and body are connected. And they didn't just write books about this stuff, they built massive institutions called bimistans. These were literally the world's first hospitals with dedicated holistic psychiatric wards. And let me be clear, these were not locked asylums. Early Muslims built beautiful, tranquil healing spaces filled with greenery and flowing water. They treated mental health with the absolute utmost dignity, utilizing things like sound therapy, art therapy, color therapy, and even aromatherapy. They deeply understood that to heal the mind, you really had to engage the entire human experience. Section 4, Bridging Therapy and Faith. So let's shift our focus to some actionable tools. We are going to look at how modern evidence-based therapy perfectly mirrors ancient Islamic practices. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how seamlessly clinical coping mechanisms are already built right into the Islamic tradition. In clinical terms, therapists talk about self-monitoring your thoughts, while in Islam, that's exactly what muraqabah is. Therapists teach relaxation techniques like deep breathing to calm the nervous system, which aligns beautifully with dhikr or meditative rhythmic remembrance. In psychology, we use cognitive restructuring to reframe negative thought patterns, and the Prophet constantly reframed difficulties as blessings in disguise to build long-term resilience. And present moment focus and mindfulness, that is exactly the instruction to perform your prayer as if it is your very last prayer, completely grounding you in the here and now. Let's take exposure therapy as an example, especially for something like social anxiety or public speaking. Therapists will often use a visualization script to help calm the patient's nervous system. Dr. Awaad points out that the Quran actually provides a divine script for this exact scenario in Surah Taha. When the prophet Musa, or Moses, is tasked with the incredibly daunting job of confronting a tyrant, he experiences profound anxiety. He even acknowledges a literal knot in his tongue. So what does he do? He recites a specific prayer to expand his chest, to ease his task, and to untie that knot in his tongue. And crucially, he asks for helper. He asks for his brother. This perfectly frames the story of Musa as a divinely scripted cognitive therapy tool for conquering social anxiety, and it proves that it is perfectly okay and even encouraged to ask for help. Section 5, Holistic Healing and Help. As we bring our cinematic journey to its supportive conclusion, we really have to focus on the ultimate goal, the true integration of the mind, the body, and the soul. The 11th century Andalusian scholar Ibn Hazm observed something incredibly profound about the human condition. He wrote, "I have found only one goal to be free from anxiety, being in the service of Allah Most High." His philosophy was basically that all human endeavors, whether it's seeking wealth to avoid being poor or seeking friends to avoid being lonely, are ultimately just ways to push away our existential dread. But dedicating our life's endeavors to a higher purpose, to the service of something vastly greater than ourselves, that naturally dispels that root anxiety. It streamlines our focus and brings a deep, lasting, unshakable calm. Let's move to and see how this builds into real-world application today. Because true healing doesn't ignore the medical side, and it certainly doesn't ignore the spiritual side. It integrates both. Dr. Awaad shares this deeply touching story of a man in his 40s, an extended family member of hers, who had suffered from crippling anxiety for decades. I mean, it affected his marriage, his kids, his everyday interactions. Finally, after all those years, he sought professional therapy, and the transformation, it was literally night and day. Do you know what his only regret was? He told her, "I wish I had done this sooner." Please, if you are struggling, don't wait to seek help. So, my final question to you is this. Will you take the step today to seek the holistic professional help that your heart and your mind truly deserve? Healing is your historical, scientific, and prophetic right. Whether it's for yourself, your child, or a loved one, the tools are out there right now, and the stigma absolutely belongs in the past. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Step into your healing, find your calm in the storm, and I will see you next time.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Imagine, if you will, walking right into the office of, well, the world's leading expert on obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Right, like the guy who literally wrote the modern medical textbook on it.
Exactly. You walk in, you hand him a piece of paper, and you tell him that the exact diagnostic criteria he has spent his entire career studying himself. I mean, mapping out and codifying was actually mapped out perfectly by a scholar in the 9th century.
Yeah, which just completely shatters the timeline of human knowledge as we know it.
It really does.
Because we operate under this deep-seated assumption, right? That psychological science is this purely modern, purely Western invention.
And that is exactly what Dr. Rania Awaad did just a few years ago. She's a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at Stanford University. And she also directs the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab. So she was walking down the hall, knocked on the door of this colleague, and brought up this ancient text.
And he dismissed her immediately, right, because he's a history buff.
Oh yeah, completely dismissed her. He had tracked OCD from the Greeks to the Romans, all the way to the 19th century. So he firmly believed it was a modern discovery.
Right, like an exclusively modern phenomenon.
Exactly. So Dr. Awaad asks him if he reads Arabic. He doesn't.
Naturally.
Yeah. So she goes back to her office, translates a section of a book written by a 9th century Muslim scholar named Abu Zaid al-Balkhi, and brings it back to him.
And, you know, the reaction to that translation is just the perfect entry point for what we are looking at today.
It really is. What did he do?
When he read the translated text, he literally started jumping up and down in his office.
Oh, wow. Just jumping up and down.
Literally. Because al-Balkhi didn't just vaguely describe someone feeling, a bit anxious. He categorized psychological illnesses with a precision that mirrors our modern diagnostic manuals.
Let's actually look at what al-Balkhi wrote, because that is the mind-blowing part to me. We aren't just talking about a lucky guess here.
Not at all. I mean, al-Balkhi explicitly distinguished between neuroses and psychoses.
A full millennium before the DSM-5.
Exactly. 1,000 years. But his work on OCD is what really had the Stanford professor jumping.
Because he detailed the actual mechanics of it,
yes.
right?
Yeah, al-Balkhi described how obsessive thoughts are intrusive, meaning they are completely alien to the person's true desires or beliefs.
Which is so validating for someone suffering from it.
Right. And he documented how these thoughts cause acute, paralyzing distress. And then he mapped out the compulsion.
The response to the distress.
Exactly. The repetitive behaviors are like the internal mental rituals the person performs in this desperate attempt to neutralize that distress.
He practically wrote the blueprint for exposure and response prevention therapy.
He really did.
Which is, the gold standard today. He talked about how you have to cognitively reevaluate those intrusive thoughts and basically block the compulsive response.
1,000 years before modern psychiatry even existed.
It's incredible. So our mission today, using Dr. Awaad's extensive lectures and research as our source material, is to completely dismantle this false dichotomy.
The dichotomy between faith and science when it comes to mental health.
Yes, exactly. We are going to explore the underlying spiritual anatomy of anxiety.
We'll examine how these ancient prophetic tools map flawlessly onto modern cognitive behavioral techniques.
And we're going to look at why seeking clinical therapy or even taking medication isn't a failure of belief.
Right. It's actually framed within the Islamic tradition as a profound act of faith.
Which is a framework we desperately need right now. I mean, if we rewind to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is where Dr. Awaad grounds a lot of her recent work, the sheer scale of the mental health crisis is still something we are failing to fully process.
Oh, entirely. We aren't just talking about people feeling a little stressed out about working from home.
No, not at all.
It was this massive systemic shock to our collective nervous system. If you look at the World Health Organization data from that first year of the pandemic.
Yeah, what did it show?
It showed a 25% increase in the global prevalence of anxiety.
Wow.
Right. That is a staggering jump in baseline human suffering.
And the timeline makes it even more intense, because by January 2021, nearly 41% of adults were reporting symptoms of clinical anxiety or depression.
Almost half the adult population.
Almost half. And for youth, specifically that 18 to 29 demographic, the rate skyrocketed to 6 times higher than they were in 2019.
6 times higher. And when you look at the neurobiology of what was happening then, it makes perfect sense.
How so?
Well, the sudden loss of routine, the isolation, the constant threat monitoring for this invisible virus, Our brains just aren't wired to sustain that level of hypervigilance.
Because the amygdala is just constantly going off.
Exactly. The amygdala acts as the brain's alarm system, and it was constantly firing. But Dr. Awaad highlights a secondary, parallel crisis that occurred alongside the anxiety itself.
Right, particularly within the Muslim American community that she addresses.
Yeah, the stigma.
Oh, the stigma is insidious. It's this pervasive cultural myth that mental health struggles just shouldn't exist if you are truly devout. The idea that if you're having a panic attack, or, if you're depressed, it just means you have weak iman, weak faith.
That you aren't praying enough, or you aren't relying on God enough.
Which is so damaging.
It essentially weaponizes a person's faith against them precisely when their brain is in a state of crisis.
It isolates them completely.
It does. And to understand the biological tragedy of that stigma, we really have to look closely at how Dr. Awaad defines anxiety.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because in clinical terms, anxiety is an intense feeling of discomfort that drives one very specific behavior, right?
Yes. Avoidance.
The avoidance cycle. I really want to break down the actual mechanics of this because it totally reframes how we think about fear.
Let's trace the neural pathway. Say you have an intense fear of public speaking.
Okay, pretty common fear.
Right. The thought of stepping onto a stage triggers your amygdala. It floods your body with adrenaline and cortisol.
Your heart rate spikes, you're sweating?
Exactly. Your brain's singular, primitive objective in that moment is survival. It literally demands that you get to safety.
So you cancel the speech, you run away.
And the moment you cancel, the perceived threat is gone. Your brain rewards you.
You feel that huge wave of relief.
But that relief is a trap. By avoiding the trigger, you have just sent a powerful message back to your amygdala.
Like, you were right, that stage was a lethal threat.
Yes, and running away just saved her life.
It's like a credit card debt of stress.
Ooh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, you defer the payment today because you don't want to deal with the discomfort, but the interest compounds massively behind the scenes.
That is exactly what happens neurologically.
Every time you avoid the stressor, the neural plasticity of that fear gets stronger. The neural pathway actually gets thicker.
So the next time you're asked to speak, the anxiety doesn't just return. It spikes exponentially higher.
Because you've trained your brain to fear it more.
You are reinforcing the fear without ever testing reality to see if the threat is actually real.
And when a community tells someone that this entirely natural biological misfiring is actually a spiritual deficiency,
they are completely misrepresenting their own religious tradition.
Which brings us to this historical story in the text that fundamentally wrecks this idea of the stoic, perfectly calm believer.
It's such a powerful story. Dr. Awaad shares this beautiful, deeply empathetic narrative about a man named Abu Umama.
He was a close companion of the Prophet Muhammad, right?
Yes. And one day, the Prophet walks into the mosque during a time when there are no scheduled prayers.
So it's totally empty.
The mosque is empty except for Abu Umama, who is just sitting there alone, clearly in distress.
Okay.
The Prophet approaches him and asks what is wrong. And Abu Umama admits he is completely overwhelmed by anxieties, worries, and this crushing financial debt.
Consider the context of that moment. If you're listening, picture this. This is a devout man sitting in a place of worship, admitting to profound, paralyzing psychological distress.
Right, and based on the modern cultural stigma we just outlined, the response should have been a lecture. He should have been told his faith was weak.
That he needed to just stop complaining and pray harder.
But the Prophet's response is the exact opposite. He doesn't shame him at all.
Not for a second.
He doesn't question his devotion. He takes 3 incredibly specific therapeutic steps.
First, he acknowledges the emotion. He doesn't tell Abu Umama to just get over it.
Which is huge validation.
Exactly. Second, he makes space for the reality of human suffering. He validates it.
And
Third, he provides a behavioral intervention. He teaches Abu Umama a specific daily supplication, a dua, to seek refuge from anxiety, sorrow, helplessness, and debt.
the precise wording of that supplication is deeply revealing, I think.
How so?
Well, it asks for refuge from anxiety and grief as primary burdens. It places psychological distress on the exact same level as physical debt and helplessness.
That's a profound equalization. And the text notes that the prophet himself recited this supplication daily.
Right. If the prophet himself made daily prayers against anxiety, how could anyone argue that experiencing it is a spiritual deficiency? It's mathematically impossible to argue that.
It totally normalizes the human nervous system.
It normalizes the baseline struggle, absolutely.
But, okay, if anxiety is a perfectly normal, biologically sound warning system, like the prophet acknowledged, how do we know when the alarm system is broken?
That's the critical question.
Right. At what point does normal, functional human worry mutate into a clinical disorder that actually requires medical intervention?
We really have to draw that line clearly, because a lot of people feel anxious and just assume they have an anxiety disorder.
While others are in the middle of a clinical crisis and think they are just stressed.
Exactly. So Dr. Awaad uses a metric from the clinical literature that I found really helpful. She calls it the 1 hour versus 5 hours rule.
Let's look at the functional side of that first. What does the 1 hour represent?
The average person without a clinical disorder spends about 1 hour a day feeling anxious. But it's fractured into tiny situational bursts.
Like,
You spend 5 minutes stressing about an email. You spend 10 minutes gripping the steering wheel because traffic is heavy and you're late for a meeting.
or you get a sudden jolt of panic wondering if you left the stove on.
Right. Those boosts are functional. The anxiety serves an evolutionary purpose. It prompts an action.
You check the stove, you send the email.
And once the action is taken or the
Yeah.
situation passes, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in.
The rest and digest system.
Exactly. The vagus nerve signals the body to release acetylcholine, which literally acts as a physical brake pedal. It slows the heart rate and returns the body to homeostasis.
But clinical anxiety operates on a totally different neurobiological scale, doesn't it?
Completely different. Someone with a clinical disorder isn't experiencing an hour of brief, functional spurts.
They are spending 5 hours or more completely consumed.
Yes, a passing thought doesn't just resolve. It triggers a massive, hours-long spiral of rumination.
They replay conversations from a week ago, analyzing every microexpression.
It crosses the threshold into clinical territory when it actively paralyzes your ability to function in your daily life.
Dr. Awaad breaks this down into specific clinical categories, which I think is helpful because the anatomy of the anxiety dictates the treatment.
Right. She starts with generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD.
Her analogy for GAD is brilliant. If you're listening, imagine you have a row of buckets in your mind.
Okay, a row of buckets.
You have a bucket for your family, a bucket for your career, a bucket for your health. For a neurotypical person, a worry usually stays in its specific bucket.
Right. If you're worried about work, it stays at work.
Exactly. But for someone with GAD, the worry is a continuous overflowing stream. It fills up the family bucket, spills over into the career bucket, floods the health bucket.
Everything is contaminated by the same baseline dread.
Everything. There are tools, like the GAD-7 self-assessment, that clinicians use to measure exactly how much those buckets are overflowing.
Then you have panic disorder. This is where the biological misfiring becomes acute.
How is it different from GAD?
Well, a panic attack does not require a rational external threat.
It just happens out of nowhere.
Right. The brain's threat detection center, the amygdala, misinterprets an internal signal, maybe a slight change in heart rate, or even just a random thought.
And it responds as if there is a literal tiger in the room.
It dumps massive amounts of adrenaline into the bloodstream. It causes chest pain, shortness of breath, and this overwhelming sense of impending doom.
It feels like a heart attack.
It does. People end up in the ER constantly because the physical symptoms are so severe.
And closely related, but distinct, is social anxiety. And Dr. Awaad makes a very sharp distinction here. This is not shyness.
Not at all. Shyness is a personality trait. Social anxiety is a paralyzing dread of judgment.
It is rooted in a hyper-awareness of social evaluation. Right?
Yes. The brain perceives the potential for social rejection as a literal threat to survival, which, evolutionarily speaking, being cast out of the tribe once was.
Sure. But in the modern world, this translates to an inability to speak in meetings, extreme isolation, and a complete avoidance of community interaction.
We also see trauma-based anxiety, specifically PTSD. The source material references Dr. Awaad's work at the VA with military veterans.
With PTSD, the anxiety is tied to sensory triggers, isn't it?
Exactly. A specific smell, the sound of a car backfiring, a certain tone of voice.
The nervous system doesn't just remember the trauma, it biologically relives it.
The veterans she worked with would often retreat to the hills, completely isolating themselves just to control their sensory environment.
And then there are phobias, which are these deeply irrational, hyper-specific fears.
But the anecdote Dr. Awaad shares regarding phobias is perhaps the most crucial moment in the entire lecture.
I agree, because it forces us to confront the friction between faith and biology.
She describes a patient who suffered from a severe phobia of airplanes.
Her family lived overseas, and she hadn't seen them in years because the fear was entirely debilitating.
But she finally gets to a point where she absolutely has to take a 13-hour international flight.
And how did she manage her nervous system during those 13 hours?
This is where it gets heavy. The patient didn't watch a movie. She didn't sleep.
She sat rigid in her seat for 13 solid hours, gripping her tasbih, her prayer beads.
And intensely reciting prayers the entire flight, suspended in a state of absolute unmitigated terror.
I really want to pause on that image because it challenges everything we think we know about spiritual coping.
It does. Gripping those prayer beads wasn't regulating her nervous system.
It wasn't bringing her a sense of profound peace or tawakkul, reliance on God.
Not at all.
Wait, so if I'm terrified of flying and I just grip my armrests and pray for 13 hours straight to keep the plane in the air,
Yeah.
you're saying that prayer might actually be functioning as a compulsion.
In that specific context, yes. It was functioning as a frantic, compulsive behavior to fend off a biologically driven panic attack.
So the spiritual practice was being hijacked by the clinical anxiety.
Exactly. The prayer didn't cure the phobia because the anatomy of a phobia requires a completely different mechanism of intervention.
That is a tough pill to swallow for someone who believes faith should conquer all fear.
It is.
I mean, if reciting prayers for 13 hours didn't stop her panic attack, how do we actually integrate faith and therapy without one overriding the other? Are we saying theology is useless here?
Not at all. We are saying that Allah created biological laws, and you have to use the right tool for the right system.
So what was the right tool for her?
The patient wasn't cured by someone telling her to just pray with more sincerity. She was cured through exposure therapy,
Which systematically unwires the neural pathway of the phobia.
the exposure breaks the avoidance cycle we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Dr. Awaad didn't just put her on a plane the next day, right?
No, they started with microexposures. The patient drove to the airport and parked her car. That was it.
Just park the car.
She sat in the car, let her anxiety spike, and crucially waited until her brain realized nothing bad was happening.
Until her vagus nerve naturally brought her heart rate down.
Right. Then, weeks later, she stood inside the terminal. Slowly, systematically, she proved to her amygdala that airplanes do not equal death.
The neuroplasticity of her brain actually changed.
Eventually, she took a flight and was utterly amazed that she could just casually watch a movie.
Okay, I understand exposure therapy in a clinical setting. It's pure behavioral science.
Right.
But how does that translate to a spiritual framework? I mean, Western psychology is secular. Islamic coping is inherently spiritual. Aren't they speaking two totally different languages?
You would think so. But Dr. Awaad does this incredible mapping exercise. Standard Western therapies all operate on the premise that endless worry is an ineffective coping mechanism.
Okay.
When you look at traditional Islamic spiritual practices, or tazkiyah, you find the exact same cognitive mechanisms, just articulated through a theological lens.
Let's dig into those parallels because this is fascinating. Western therapy relies heavily on self-monitoring, right?
Right, noticing your internal monologue, catching negative thoughts before they spiral.
So what's the Islamic equivalent?
In the Islamic framework, that precise cognitive function is called muhasabah. It is the spiritual practice of deep self-accountability.
So you don't just act, you constantly examine your inner state.
You examine the origins of your thoughts. It is an ancient form of metacognition, thinking about how you think.
Then you have relaxation techniques. A therapist will teach you box breathing or diaphragmatic breathing to regulate your physical nervous system.
And Dr. Awaad maps this directly to dhikr, the repetitive remembrance of God.
Because dhikr isn't just a mental exercise.
It is highly physiological. It often involves rhythmic, controlled breathing, moving the tongue in a specific cadence, and focusing on a singular intention.
And the mechanics of dhikr inherently stimulate the vagus nerve.
Exactly, initiating that parasympathetic relaxation response we discussed earlier.
What about cognitive restructuring? In therapy, if I catastrophize and think losing this job means my life is over, the therapist helps me restructure that belief.
Right, into something like, losing this job is difficult, but I have skills and I will find another path.
So how does that map over?
The Islamic equivalent is deeply embedded in the concept of tawakkul, reliance on God. But it goes beyond just passive reliance.
It's active.
The prophetic tradition mandates actively reframing the narrative of hardship.
So instead of viewing a sudden illness or a job loss purely as a random tragedy or a divine punishment,
it is cognitively restructured as a test, a means of purification, or a hidden blessing meant to elevate the person's character.
that completely changes the brain's relationship to the stressor. You move from being a victim of chaos to being a participant in a purposeful narrative.
It dismantles the negative core belief at the root of the anxiety.
And when we look at the modern psychological obsession with mindfulness, anchoring yourself in the present moment to stop ruminating about the past or dreading the future, the Islamic tradition has startlingly direct applications.
The sapling hadith.
Yes, this is my favorite example from the text.
It's brilliant.
There is a prophetic command that says, if you are holding a sapling in your hand and the day of judgment literally begins, the world is actively ending, you should still plant the sapling.
Think about the psychological architecture of that command.
The ultimate catastrophe is occurring. The future is literally canceled.
And anxiety is entirely predicated on fearing the future.
Right.
But the directive is to completely sever your attention from the apocalyptic future and anchor it entirely in the microscopic action of the present moment.
The soil, the seed, your hand.
It is the ultimate cognitive grounding technique.
Dr. Awaad also talks about scripted cognitive activities. In a secular setting, a therapist might give you a visualization script to calm down.
They'll say, imagine you are sitting by a calm river watching leaves float by.
Which works for some people, sure, but it can feel a bit arbitrary.
For a patient whose worldview is entirely constructed around faith, a secular script might lack the emotional resonance required to actually shift their nervous system.
So Dr. Awaad suggests using scripts native to their theology.
Exactly. She uses the story of Prophet Musa, or Moses, from Surah Taha in the Quran.
So Musa receives this divine directive to go confront Pharaoh.
And Pharaoh is a massive genocidal tyrant. It is a terrifying mission.
And Musa doesn't just nod and march off. He experiences profound, paralyzing anxiety.
But the Quranic text captures the biological realism of that panic. Musa specifically mentions having a knot in his tongue.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting. It's a physical manifestation of dread, a speech impediment brought on by severe anxiety.
And he doesn't try to stoically push through it. He utilizes a specific scripted request.
He asks God to open his chest.
To physically relieve the tight, constricting feeling of panic in his torso, he asks for the knot in his tongue to be untied.
And this is the part that completely shatters the stigma. He explicitly asks for a helper.
He tells God he needs his brother Harun to go with him.
The psychological brilliance of that request cannot be overstated. It destroys the myth of the lone, isolated believer who must conquer their demons entirely alone through sheer spiritual willpower.
Musa, one of the greatest prophets, looked at the task, looked at his own nervous system, and said, I need backup. I need human, external support.
It is a divine endorsement of seeking help.
It really is.
If you are sitting in your car right now or listening to this on a walk, and you've been feeling deeply ashamed that you might need to talk to a therapist or that you might need a prescription to get your baseline anxiety under control, look at the story of Musa.
He explicitly asked for an intervention.
It makes asking for help an act of prophetic emulation. It's not a weakness, it's wisdom.
And the synthesis we are discussing, merging the physical reality of the body with the spiritual reality of the soul, is not some modern 21st century attempt to make therapy palatable to religious folks.
No, not at all.
This is a revival of a system that was the global standard of care over 1,000 years ago.
Let's go back to that timeline. We talked about al-Balkhi mapping out OCD in the 9th century. But he wasn't a lone genius operating in a vacuum.
No, the Islamic Golden Age was fundamentally rethinking the architecture of the human mind.
We have to look at Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna.
He is essentially the pioneer of psychosomatic medicine.
Because he understood that the mind and the body are deeply intertwined, inextricably linked in a feedback loop.
The source material details a fascinating clinical case of his. He was called to treat a man experiencing severe manic behavior.
Like wild mood swings, laughing, crying, intense physical distress.
Right, and the local doctors were totally baffled.
They probably thought it was purely physical, or maybe spiritual possession. How does Ibn Sina approach it?
He runs a primitive but highly effective psychological experiment. He doesn't just look at the physical symptoms. He takes the man's wrist to monitor his pulse.
Okay.
But then he starts reciting the names of different cities in the region.
Wait, while holding his pulse?
Yes. It's an ancient form of biofeedback. He is using raw physiological data heart rate to uncover a hidden psychological trigger.
Oh, wow.
As he lists the cities, the man's pulse remains steady. But when Ibn Sina says one specific city, the pulse dramatically spikes.
He found the trigger.
He found the geographical location of the trigger, so he narrows it down. He starts listing the distinct neighborhoods within that specific city.
And let me guess, the pulse jumps again, at a certain neighborhood.
Exactly. Again, the pulse is steady until he hits one neighborhood and the heart rate jumps. He narrows it further, listing the prominent families in that neighborhood.
That is unbelievable. He is literally interrogating the man's nervous system.
Precisely. He tracks the biological responses until he zeroes in on one specific woman in one specific family.
And what was the diagnosis?
Ibn Sina diagnoses the man with lovesickness.
Wow.
He realizes the root cause of this profound physical and manic distress is entirely psychological and intense, unfulfilled obsession.
So what was the prescription?
His prescription wasn't a potion or a pill. He prescribed that the man's family arrange a marriage to this woman.
And did it work?
Once the psychological distress was resolved, the manic physical symptoms completely vanished.
Ibn Sina proved that human biology is fundamentally obedient to the mind.
He did. But it wasn't just physicians doing clinical work. The philosophers of this era were tearing apart the existential roots of anxiety, too.
Like Ibn Hazm, a 10th century scholar from Andalusia, he proposed what you might call a grand, unified theory of human behavior.
He observed society and asked a fundamental question: why do we do anything?
Right. Why do we build, work, socialize, or play?
He argued that literally every human endeavor is fundamentally an attempt to push away anxiety.
It's like humanity is collectively treading water.
How do you mean?
We build careers and hoard wealth to push away the anxiety of poverty. We constantly socialize and surround ourselves with noise to push away the anxiety of loneliness.
We play games and seek entertainment to push away the anxiety of boredom.
Exactly. We are just kicking our legs frantically to keep our heads above this deep, dark ocean of existential dread.
That is a perfect encapsulation of his philosophy. We are constantly repelling distress.
But Ibn Hazm concluded that treading water is exhausting and ultimately futile because the ocean of anxiety is infinite.
So what was his solution?
His philosophical solution was that the only true path to dispelling baseline existential anxiety was to stop kicking wildly and instead align all those human endeavors toward a singular higher purpose.
In his theological framework, that meant living entirely in the service of Allah.
Right. By doing so, the fragmented fears of poverty, rejection, and boredom are consumed by a sense of ultimate, cohesive meaning.
So you have al-Balkhi writing the clinical manuals, Ibn Sina doing psychosomatic biofeedback, and Ibn Hazm outlining the existential philosophy.
But they didn't just write books and leave it at that. They scaled this holistic philosophy into the actual infrastructure of society.
And this brings us to the Bimaristans.
The Bimaristans or Maristans. This is arguably the most vital historical reality we need to uncover today.
The Islamic world built the very first dedicated psychiatric hospitals in human history.
This completely shifted my perspective. Because when we think of historical psychiatric care in the West, we pictured 18th and 19th century asylums.
Places like Bedlam.
Yes. Dark, punitive, locked facilities where people were chained to walls, hidden away from polite society, and treated essentially like animals.
The Western asylum model was largely built on containment and isolation.
But the Bimaristans were conceptually, medically, and architecturally the exact opposite.
They viewed the human being as an indivisible unit of mind, body, and soul.
They didn't see a moral division between a physical ailment, like a broken leg, and a psychological ailment like severe depression.
Both required immediate care, profound dignity, and a highly sophisticated approach to healing.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Dr. Awaad describes the environment of these spaces, and we have to spend time on this because it sounds like a modern, high-end luxury retreat, not a 9th century hospital.
They weren't sterile at all.
No, they were built around central courtyards with elaborate fountains.
And the fountains were not merely decorative, they understood acoustic therapy.
The sound frequency of falling water mimics white noise, which naturally downregulates the sympathetic nervous system.
You cannot perform cognitive talk therapy on a patient whose nervous system is in a state of acute hyperarousal. You have to soothe the biology first.
So they literally engineered the architecture to lower the patient's heart rates.
They also utilized light therapy, controlling how sunlight entered the rooms based on the time of day.
They used aromatherapy, burning specific herbs and resins known to have calming effects.
They employed musicians to play specific maqams, melodic modes, tailored to the patient's emotional state.
They even integrated physical touch through massage.
It was a total sensory regulation protocol.
They surrounded the dysregulated biology with external regulation: sound, smell, light, touch, while simultaneously addressing the psychology.
Through what we would now call cognitive behavioral therapy.
And soothing the soul through spiritual counseling and community support.
The Bimaristans were often located in the very center of the city, too.
Really? Not on the outskirts.
No, structurally integrating the patients into the heartbeat of the community rather than exiling them.
Imagine how profoundly validating it must be for someone listening right now, someone who is struggling with their mental health and maybe feeling a deep sense of shame because their community tells them mental illness is a Western fabrication. To realize that their spiritual ancestors were literally the pioneers of compassionate, holistic psychological care.
It is their heritage. It reclaims the narrative entirely.
It proves that science and faith have always been allies in the pursuit of healing.
Which brings us to the urgent, practical imperative of action today. We've validated anxiety, we've explored the history, but what do we do with a panic attack right now?
Dr. Awaad is very firm about avoiding extremes when seeking treatment. You can't just pick one lane.
She warns that going purely medical, just demanding a pill from a psychiatrist while completely ignoring the psychological trauma or the spiritual emptiness at the root of the issue is an incomplete strategy.
The pill regulates the serotonin, but it doesn't teach you how to reframe your thoughts.
But on the flip side, relying purely on spiritual interventions is also dangerous.
Right. If you refuse therapy and refuse medication because you think praying harder will fix a severe chemical imbalance, you are ignoring the biological reality of the body God gave you.
And my favorite call out from her lecture, relying on folk medicine.
Oh, the cultural auntie who tells you to just drink some 7-Up, read a verse, and lie down to cure clinical depression.
A 7-Up cure. It's somewhat humorous, but it highlights a tragic lack of mental health literacy.
True healing requires the integration of the Bimaristan model. Mind, body, soul, and clinical medicine working in tandem.
And this integration is deeply sanctioned by Islamic theology itself.
There is a specific hadith where the companions of the Prophet ask him a very direct question. Should we seek out medical treatments?
And his reply is categorical.
He says yes. Allah does not send down a disease or an illness unless he sends with it a treatment or a cure.
That statement provides the foundational theology of medicine for this tradition.
It frames the scientific pursuit of cures and the individual act of walking into a therapist's office, not as a lack of reliance on God, but as an active, mandatory participation in the systems God created.
Medical intervention is simply the delivery mechanism of the divine cure. To reject the medicine is to reject the cure that was provided.
And the human cost of rejecting that medicine because of stigma is devastating.
Toward the end of her lecture, Dr. Awaad shares a deeply personal story that brings all of this theory crashing down into reality.
She talks about a male relative of hers in his 40s.
For his entire life, everyone in the family knew he suffered from crippling anxiety.
He would sit on the periphery of family gatherings, visibly consumed by dread, constantly verbalizing catastrophic what-ifs about his career, his kids, his future.
It poisoned his ability to be present. And this touches on a specific demographic challenge that Dr. Awaad encounters frequently.
What's that?
There is a profound entrenched stigma regarding mental health treatment among men in many traditional cultures.
Oh, absolutely. Vulnerability is heavily coded as weakness.
To sit on a couch and admit to a therapist that you are terrified is seen as a total loss of masculine control.
So he just suffered for decades.
It affected his marriage, his ability to parent, his entire quality of life.
But eventually the pain became greater than the stigma. He finally went to therapy.
And Dr. Awaad says the transformation was staggering.
It was night and day. He learned how to regulate his nervous system, how to challenge his catastrophic thoughts. It saved his marriage.
You were looking at a completely revitalized human being. The tragedy, however, lies in his reflection once he was finally healthy.
Yeah. He looked back at his life and asked Dr. Awaad, why didn't anyone catch this sooner? I wish my parents had seen the red flags and gotten me help when I was a teenager.
He started grieving the decades he lost to untreated fear.
He started falling down the psychological rabbit hole of, what if my whole life had been different?
And Dr. Awaad's response to him is a crucial piece of advice for anyone listening who is finally getting help and feeling that exact same wave of regret.
She told him, definitively, not to open the door to what-ifs.
Because you can't change the past, and dwelling on it just breeds despair.
In the Islamic psychological framework, dwelling on the unchangeable past in a way that induces paralysis or despair is seen as opening the door for shaitan.
The adversarial force that whispers negativity and hopelessness?
The focus must rigorously shift to the present. The healing starts the moment you seek the cure.
She told him to march forward.
So, what does this all mean for you, the listener? That is the exact directive for anyone listening who recognizes themselves in these stories. March forward.
The resources exist today to bridge these two worlds.
Dr. Awaad mentions that through organizations like Meristan, which is actively working to revive the holistic model of those ancient hospitals, there are directories of hundreds of Muslim mental health professionals.
Just in Michigan alone, right?
Yes, just in Michigan alone via meristan.org. You can find a clinician who understands the DSM-5 and understands the spiritual nuance of tawakkul.
You don't have to choose between your science and your soul.
We have covered immense ground today. We started by dismantling the myth of the perfectly calm believer, examining how anxiety is fundamentally an over-functioning biological avoidance mechanism.
We traced the neurobiology of panic and saw how prophetic practices like the physiological regulation of dhikr and the story of Musa explicitly asking for human backup perfectly align with modern cognitive restructuring and exposure therapy.
We traveled back a millennium to watch al-Balkhi map out the precise criteria for OCD centuries before Western psychiatry.
And we walked through the acoustically engineered holistic wards of the ancient Bimeristans.
You don't have to leave your religious identity at the door of the therapist's office, and you don't have to leave your rational brain outside the mosque. They were always meant to operate as a single, cohesive unit.
Which leaves us with a provocative question to consider long after this deep dive ends.
What's that?
If our ancestors built the world's first holistic psychiatric wards over 1,000 years ago, explicitly seeing no moral division between a physical illness and mental distress,
Right.
What does it say about our modern society that we still treat mental health as a taboo? What if true spiritual resilience isn't the complete absence of anxiety, but rather the courage to seek out the tools, both medical and divine, to face it head-on?
That is exactly the paradigm shift we need. Mental health might not give us a clean, jagged white line on an X-ray to point out. It is murky and it is complex. But the map to navigate it has been there for centuries, waiting for us to read it. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep seeking knowledge, and take care of yourselves.